sign, we lived in small band hunter-gatherer groupings, where kids were always around adults, and many adults, so that they just felt ensconced in a network of safe and consistent attachments. And more civilization happens, the more that breaks down. But even until recently, most children grew up around adults, even in the Western world. Now, in our society today, the breakup of families and communities and the globalization and destruction of local economic structures, the malls and the Costco's and the Walmarts and the car culture and the both parents having to work and the high divorce rate. Never mind kids are around. Never mind the kids are not around adults. A whole lot of adults, they're not around even their parents.
They're around sometimes just a hostile or negatively sexualized culture,
or well, actually, in specifically young kids are on kindergartens. Okay, and so it's just like the duckling. So the duckling will attach, imprint on whoever's around. So will the kid, and who's around are other kids. So our children have become peer attached, peer oriented, and the problem with that, as Gordon points out, is that we get our sense of direction and values and who we are and what's meaningful and what's important and how to talk and how to look and how to walk from the people that we're oriented towards. And we're oriented towards the ones that we're attached to. So now kids are oriented to other kids. And then we've given them this stuff. So that even when they're not with each other, they're with each other. And so parents have completely lost their moorings and their position and that kind of the situation you discussed, that it's almost like parents today have to fight the culture to hold on to their kids, whereas before the culture would support the parents being with their kids.
It's gotten so bad. I was in China or in Japan as well, and there was a conference, and we were looking at 4 to 7-year-olds who are on digital devices more than 4 to 6 hours a day.
That's right.
Are losing their capacity to recognize human emotion, which is a basic human birthright in a sense.
Not only is it a birthright, it's a necessity.
A necessity, exactly. Yeah. So it's like I'm not sure where we need to go after Hold On to Your Kids, but to me it absolutely did lead to all the problems that you start to elucidate in When the Body Says No, which I guess was about the same time in published.
But that came out a little bit before Hold On to Your Kids.
Did it? Okay.
Yeah, but within a year of each other.
But the stress, the mounting stress that happens to the neuroendocrine, the developing brain, and everything else, and the ensuing chronic diseases that we're starting to really pinpoint these connections at this point, Gabor. It's it's overwhelming. It's this book, if you haven't read it, so When the Body Says No, this is required reading of all the integrative health students in this program, and because your narratives in here bring the stories home with such compassion. I just thank you for that.
Well, again, and that was based on, thanks for the acknowledgement, that was based on the fact that in family practice and in palliative care, I got a pretty good sense. Here's the thing, as a family physician, you get to see people before they get sick. You also get to see families in multi-generational connections. The specialist only sees you once you're sick. And so they have no idea what you were like before, or what your family background is, nor are they trained to ask or to notice. So they just focus in on the physical process in a particular organ. That's what they look at. Now, you just can't help noticing if your eyes are open. Well, you can help it. A lot of doctors never notice it, but is that who gets sick and who doesn't isn't accidental. So the people that develop like chronic illness, like rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, and so on, these are not natural diseases. They are the results of a certain kind of life. Amongst North American natives, there was virtually no autoimmune disease. No autoimmune disease. And now, that same population is highly affected by autoimmune disease within the last 100 years. So 120 years. So something has happened, and actually what's happened is stress. And so people who generate stress in their lives in sometimes ways that they don't, not often in in ways that they can't recognize, are prone to cancer or autoimmune disease for the simple reason that Meg and I were talking about before the talk. There's this whole science called psychoneuroimmunology, which studies the connection between the psyche, that's to say the emotional centers in the brain, the nervous system, the hormonal apparatus, and the immune system. And even when I say it studies the connections, and this will be the topic of the workshop tomorrow, I think, even to say that it studies the connections is inaccurate, because it creates the idea that somehow separate systems are connected. But they're not separate systems. So that the psyche, the immune system, the hormonal system, the nervous system, they're the same apparatus.
It is. Well, it's the same dualism that permeates all of medical orthodoxy still. I mean, it just, it's been a long time reattaching the head to the body for myself in an integrative kind of way, because it's our own medical and nursing conditioning and that you go through. You start to learn to separate everything. But when you get more in touch with the body's inner state and you sense, my gosh, there are ways of self-soothing, there are ways of social support, of relations, that's all part of my healing journey here, and connecting those dots. But the one that really stands in stark contrast for me now is loneliness.
Yeah.
Can loneliness make us sick?
Well, and we know that, I'll give you one example. A study in Australia looked at 500 women with breast biopsies, breast lumps that needed to be assayed for malignancy. And the women underwent a psychological interview. And when the results came back, it turned out that if the woman was highly stressed, that by itself did not increase the risk of developing cancers. If she was emotionally isolated around the time that the lump appeared, that also did not increase the chance of developing cancers. But if she was stressed and isolated, the risk of developing cancers was 9 times as great as the average. And the researchers could not figure this one out, because they said, how does 0 and 0 add up to 9? But of course what happens is, and again I'll talk about more in this detail tomorrow, I think. If say you, sir, in the front was highly stressed right now, your stress would not just be an emotional state, it would be a physiological state, with your nervous system firing off and your immune system and your hormones, stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, high levels. But if your friend next to you said, hey, how you doing? Do you want to talk about it? Immediately your stress levels go down and you're fine. But what happens if there's nobody to talk to? Not for months. You'll be stewing in this juice of physiological stress. And you know what it's like. I've been in that situation where something happens in your life and you're really upset about it and you have no way of resolving it. And then you just keep going over it. Well, your body's in turmoil. Well, no wonder then and of course what we know is that the stress hormones, which saves your life in the short term, will kill you in the long term. Specifically, they suppress your immune system. So no wonder then that the woman who's stressed and isolated has got a much higher chance of dying. So yes, not just loneliness in the sense of emotional loneliness, but even you can have lots of friends, but if you're not sharing with them,
If you're not reaching out.
if you're not reaching out, and if you're not receiving, you're going to have greater chance of dying. And all kinds of studies have shown that the lonelier people get sicker, they get more sick, and they die sooner of the illnesses.
What about the person who is a loner, the introvert, who says, I don't need to reach out. I have my holistic breathwork practice. I do my yoga. I do this and that. I have my list of all my holistic self-care practices. I mean, it seems as though in this age of interpersonal neurobiology and everything, we're saying, no, social relations matter. We keep coming back to that. And I worry about the self-isolating introvert.
Well, so I'm pretty sure that if the Buddha had isolated himself for 40 years, he would not have got sick. When you're at that level of realization and differentiation, when you really know who you are,
Okay.
and all your choices are made consciously, then if you choose to be alone really consciously, because you're just going to connect with
With the divine, you're not really alone.
with whatever you're going to connect with, you're going to be okay. but I want to know who that person is who's saying that. In other words, if he's not the Buddha, then I'm worried about him or her. Because they could be saying those beautiful things out of strict emotional defensiveness, out of deep hurt, out of a sense that if I was in a relationship, I'd be unhappy. I wouldn't know how to negotiate or navigate that. So that person then is at risk. It doesn't matter what they tell themselves. So it's not the conscious stuff we tell ourselves. It's who we are. Who's the person saying it? Where are they coming from, actually?
That's it. All right, let's go to East Hastings a minute. Okay, this is the neighborhood that he has described in his book in the realm of hungry ghosts that can actually be seen from satellite. It is such an area of massive despair, blight, people in the streets. And Vancouver, rather, took a look at it, and I think it was 2003, and started Insight, which was North America's first safe injection site, and On-Site as well. They had a drug treatment program.
Yeah, that's
what did you work with?
I worked on On-Site, the second floor upstairs.
You did.
Yeah.
You were upstairs. So I had to cross Falls Creek, walk over there, and I could get over to the East Hastings neighborhood, and it was such a tale of two cities, similar to what we have here in San Francisco, right? We see it all the time. Growing massive disparities. We have Twitter, which we just took a bite over there at that massive headquarters over there, and I showed them the oyster bar and everything else, but in the walk back, you can actually be stepping over bodies of people in this back alley here with heroin needles hanging out their arms. So in San Francisco right now, Mayor Lee is considering, do we establish a safe injection site? Yes. What would your recommendation be? You've worked at them.
Well, it's like, are we in favor of oxygen, you know? Because the proof that it saves lives and improves lives is as positive as is that oxygen is necessary for life. It's just that obvious. Here's what you got in the United States right now. You have about 130, 140 overdoses every day in your country right now, which means that every month you got the equivalent of 9/11. Now we keep rabbiting on about the terrorist threat. Your chance, of American dying from terrorism is like next to zero, unless you go over there and terrorize them into not being terrorists. Then there might be a battle. But actually, you got the equivalent of a 9/11 every day, every month. And when you think of or to get a closer analogy, you take the SARS virus, all the public health resources and all the public alarm and all the newspaper print that was spilled over it and the media coverage and the governmental mobilization. It touched very few people, a few dozen maybe. And here now you got 9/11 happening every month. And nobody's doing anything about it. Which simply has to do with whose lives matter and whose lives don't matter. And now the supervised injection site is not there's a quick solution to the heroin overdose.
Yeah.
There's actually an immediate solution. The immediate solution is make opiates available under supervised conditions to confirmed dependent people. So in Vancouver, there's a clinic that actually prescribes heroin for people. And they come there 3 or 4 times a day and they inject it. No overdoses. Now, because of the illegality of the substance, of course, most people not having access to that kind of facility, what do? They have to buy it in the streets. And from dealers who are going to put into fentanyl or whatever it is, So we've created this opioid crisis with our totally irrational laws. And then we don't refuse to look at the international evidence of what would work. Supervised injection, prescribed opiates, and all that. It's not even minutely controversial if you look at the evidence. And so when you say, is it a good idea? Well, yeah, it's a good idea.
Oh, they think the last report I had when I was at Global was Vancouver estimates they saved maybe 5,000 lives just from prevention of spread of HIV, hepatitis C, that's the amount of just needles scattered on the ground and litter.
Absolutely. Mind you, I have to say that we're losing again because of the fentanyl stuff.
Is that right?
Yeah, there's so many people dying of famine. I'm still involved. I'm not working clinically, but I'm still involved in a major organization that services the downtown Eastside, and a lot of people have succumbed to the fentanyl overdose crisis, and now they're scrambling around establishing more supervised clinics and making it easier and all that. But they will not do, even in BC, they will not do the only rational thing, which is to prescribe the heroin to people, so they don't have to buy it in the streets.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so that, and they're not even thinking about decriminalizing the drugs, which is absolutely essential.
Well, it's being considered, and it's a first step here in San Francisco, and I think we could all weigh in on it as well, because we have a strong harm reduction emphasis here at CIIS. We've also, you know, in terms of the addiction that you covered there, you've had one character who's online who's one of your big critics. Can I bring him up? Is that okay? You've already answered him several times.
No, I've never answered him.
You haven't?
No, I will not engage with him.
Who's character?
I don't talk to rabid dogs. I just don't. And he's rabid. I mean, literally, he's rabid.
He's rabid, and he
Yeah.
doesn't, you know, he doesn't buy the attachment theory stuff. He doesn't look at, you know, on one hand, you don't know if he's for harm
Listen, you
reduction
want to know
or
the story?
not.
He came to me, asked me to endorse his book in which he misrepresents my work.
Oh,
I
this
said, I will
sounds-
not endorse a book that misrepresents my work. Then he starts attacking me online.
Mm.
I don't engage with the guy.
Okay, good.
I don't. And he does not, you know, he says things like that I think the brain is damaged from birth and by stress and trauma and is irreparable. I say the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
I said directly the opposite. You know, so there's nobody at home to debate with. He's a traumatized man who's got a bit of a name in the addiction world, but I've never answered him. I don't debate with him,
When you
and
read
I will
his
not.
material, it sounds like he's in pain himself. is what
Oh,
I'm
he's in
saying.
deep pain. He's in deep pain. I met him. He's in deep pain, but he doesn't want to deal with that pain.
Okay.
So he hates the idea that I talk about trauma, because if it was true, he'd have to look at his own. He doesn't want to do that.
But all the
Even 2 weeks ago, he wrote this thing about how this guy's got no sense of humor, and he actually projects. I only wish he was right, you see, because he says that I'm the head of a big international trauma industry. I mean,
Wouldn't that be great?
would to God it was true.
Well, I'm glad I brought him up to flesh out that truth. I was wondering about that.
That I had all this power, you know, and then, you know, I mean, I get.
So when I read him, I get a sense of the ACE studies, the Adverse Childhood Experiences
Yeah.
studies, which is just keeps pouring in all the time. Kaiser did some of the first work with it in the late 90s, and the facts and figures on this of painful circumstances, whether it was family violence or divorce or
Yeah.
drug or alcohol use disorders in the family, and the linking of 7 to 10 times greater risk than to substance abuse. These adverse childhood experiences is something that you circled around your whole life in terms of both books, really.
Yeah, well, 3 of the 4 books anyway.
Yeah.
For sure. You know, here's a really amazing story. So these adverse childhood experiences studies, the AC studies, were done here in California under the Kaiser Permanente system. One of the chief investigators is a good colleague of mine, Dr. Vince Felitti, who works internal medicine specialist in San Diego. And his work he was working at an obesity clinic. And they found that they could help people lose weight with rigorous dietary control and exercise. Guess what they couldn't do? They couldn't help people keep it off.
That's right.
And so he says, what's going on here? And then he did this amazing thing. He actually listened to his patients. And they said, don't you get it? We're eating to soothe ourselves from childhood pain. And that then initiated the study where they looked at 15,000 people, I think close 16,000 people. Californians, mostly Caucasians, at least 50% had been to college. And they just found that the more childhood adversity, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, a parent dying, a divorce, a parent being jailed, violence in the family, a parent being addicted or mentally ill, neglect, for each of these ACEs, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially. They don't add up, they multiply, number one. And number two, so does the risk of mental illness, psychosis, attention problems, behavior problems, and autoimmune disease go up, significantly. So this is Kaiser Permanente. Now here's the punchline. 4 years ago, I was invited by Kaiser Permanente in San Diego to present a talk on addiction to some of their clinicians. Right? And so a month before the program, they sent me an email saying, could you send us some supportive literature that buttresses your point of view? I said, yes. Studies done in your organization in San Diego. They didn't know about it.
Take a look at your own files. How could
They
have
did
missed
not
it?
know about it.
Oh, that's crazy.
Now, my point is that, like everything I've been talking about today with Meg, the research is being done and done and done, and more stuff keeps coming in every day, and it makes not a bit of difference in the clinical world. It's like it didn't exist. It sinks without a stone. That's why the first chapter, when the body says no, is called the Bermuda Triangle, because the evidence comes in, and it's published. It's published in major journals. It's not published in fly-by-night, California granola publications. It's published in.
Some of those.
Yeah, but that's not where it's published. It's published in serious journals, and it has no impact on clinical awareness, medical ideology, or clinical practice, which is a whole other subject. The resistance or the imperviousness to reality is tremendous.
It is tremendous, and there's also a suppression of negative data that doesn't always support a pharmacological perspective as well. I mean, we see both happening. I was your KTVU health reporter for years, and I was working on a story that was the first indication that there may be some problems with hormone replacement therapy with women. In fact, it doubled the stroke and heart attack rates. And it was completely suppressed from many of the peer-reviewed journals at the time. And I was ready to give the story on it at KTVU, and I was tapped on the shoulder by the news producer saying, Meg, could you kill that story or rewrite it, please? We have an ad from Wyeth Erst, makers of Premarin, at 6 p.m. So much of our news is commercially shaped, much of our news. And I think this is why your books, yes, they were well received by the medical profession, but it was the actual public. Oh, they were banned by the medical profession. It was the public that went after them.
The public.
Absolutely.
Look, this month I get to speak to the Massachusetts Medical Society, who publishes the New England Journal of Medicine. So I'm getting somewhere, but it's very slow. But you know what? When you said that about your director telling you to kill the story, I thought of that line from Casablanca, where I'm shocked that capitalism controls the flow of information to the public. Really? How is this possible?
That was news alert.
Yeah.
We've gone from. I want to move into this next chapter that I see, though. I'm on the milestone journey here of these books, and yes, indeed, the biopsychosocial model, it resonates in the hallways of CIIS. But so does the biopsycho-spiritual model as well. And your work with the plant world, the communication, the deeper soulful messages that you're receiving about what actually triggers a healing response within. If you could take us down that journey.
Well, I will, but spirituality, to just make sure that we don't confuse or at least confound spirituality with plant work. Spirituality has existed quite nicely, thank you very much, without people doing hallucinogenic drugs, or substances. So that's one part of it. Yeah. So I'm just reading a wonderful book, one of the best trauma books ever written, by my friend and teacher and colleague, Peter Levine, called In an Unspoken Voice, for which I actually wrote the foreword, but I had not read the book in detail because it was a deadline. So I caught the essence of it, but I'm reading it. I'm just so impressed by his work on trauma. And his last chapter is on the healing of trauma and spirituality. And it is not necessarily, and he's talking about shamanic perspectives, but not necessarily to do with mind-altering plants. So the essence of shamanism is precisely what you touched upon. You talk about the healing capacity. And the Western medicine does not recognize that people have a healing capacity. It's all about curing. So, like you cure meat, you're doing something to it from the outside to make it better. And I'm not dismissing that, except to say that it lacks the perspective that healing is a capacity of any biological organism.
But you go so far in that forward, though, to actually quote Thomas Hora,
Yeah.
all problems are psychological, but all solutions are spiritual.
Right.
That's a big leap.
It is in the sense that, and I don't know where psychology ends and spirituality begins. I mean, I just think it's a fluid, dynamic boundary there.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Western psychology is being focused on making the ego function better. And that's important enough. I mean, there's a lot of people whose ego doesn't function well, and then they become president of the United States. You can see what damage that does. So if only his ego was a bit healthier,
Yeah.
the world would be a little bit safer. But it doesn't recognize that the ego itself is a construct, and that the ego itself comes out of a defensive need and out of a loss of a sense of who we actually are. When we're not identified with emotions and thoughts and body, so that there's something deeper to us. And so, although you can't go teaching or preaching spirituality to people, ultimately healing comes from a deeper place, and it comes from a connection to something greater than just what the ego can encompass. Now, yes, I do work with plants and other. I did a healing session, a 6-hour one, this Sunday with a substance called 3-MMC, which is not a plant, it's a man-made product, but this highly traumatized person from California, actually, he came up to Vancouver. It's incredible what he connected with in 6 hours. It would have taken 10 years of psychotherapy, would not have got him there, and it did not get him there. So I have all kinds of respect and use for the power of the psychedelic in the pure sense of the word, meaning mind manifesting, throwing light on the mind. But so that can of course, and it will have a spiritual dimension, but it's also deeply psychological, and the two are again in a very fluid balance.
A fluid balance that we would fully embrace here in our integral approach. As you know, you've helped us, you've been given good support to our psychedelic assisted therapies and research certificate program,
Yeah.
the CIIS Center for Psychedelic Therapies and Research. And
Which is a pioneering program. It's the first one
it's
anywhere.
Wonderful. We're very happy and pleased with Dr. Janice Phelps and her hard work with everybody there, and all the first rung of therapists have come through, and healing clinicians. I just had somebody write to me before this. They knew I was going to be talking with you tonight, and they said, I don't get it. If taking drugs and plants is just a means to soothe an aching spirit or a psyche, why would any therapist espouse taking entheogenic substances to heal the same psyche? I don't get it. You guys are doing double speak there.
Okay.
And this was a really alarming email I got from somebody who had done an ayahuasca journey years ago, but dismissed it.
It's a common question. It's a good one to deal with. First of all, does this person know the meaning of the word entheogenic?
Probably not.
Well, theo is the God,
Yeah.
and theo is the God within. Entheogenic brings up the God within, the wholeness, the goodness. So why would somebody work with a substance that brings up the goodness and the wholeness within? That's why. Now,
Thank you.
as to the fair question of people that are addicted to substances, why they're using a substance, that has to do with what's being called set and setting. So that has to do with what is the intention, and who's the person doing it, why are they doing it, with what purpose, and what is the context in which they do it. So, say, take something like tobacco. So that tobacco was used by native people in North America and South America for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. as a spiritual sacrament and as a source of insight and strength. And they were never addicted to it. So that there's nothing addictive about tobacco itself. It can be used purely as a teacher. And in the Amazon, just as much as in the plains of Canada or United States, they use tobacco that way. Then you get misery, colonialization, and dislocation, and trauma, and suffering. And now, people start using the same substance differently. So, and for different purposes. So, it's very, when you do an ayahuasca ceremony, it's not like you're given a bit of ayahuasca, take this every day, go home and take it every day as you would a drug. You're actually coming into a ceremony. And the ayahuasca is not the thing. The thing is the ceremony. The thing is what actually happens. But that's very much aided by the mind-opening nature of the plant. There's nothing in the least bit addictive about it. No, on the contrary, I mean, who the heck wants to? It's bitter, actually, I figured out, I don't know, sorry to go on, but...
I want you to go on.
Jesus must have taken ayahuasca, because in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before he's arrested, he says to God, take this, if you can, Lord, take this bitter brew from my hands. Wow. If I must drink it, I'll drink it. No, he's not talking about ayahuasca.
It's
a bit of a stretch, but he might as well be, because it tastes very bitter. And so.
He was looking at his sheer defeat. He was looking at the agony.
Yeah, and he was also saying, but not my will, but your will.
Yeah, the surrender.
Yeah, I'm going to do it. It's not going to be the way I want it. It's going to be the way you want it. And I don't like it, but I'll do it the way. So it essentially is teaching surrender, which really what one has to do in ceremony if one is going to get benefit from it.
Oh, it is a big surrender. I mean, I've done many a journey in South America, some up here, but I've also felt that the debrief afterwards was really important. And maybe it was because I'm a Western-born woman with a Western-trained mind that needed that kind of debrief afterwards. That the one journey I did do in Peru, I was just kind of let loose to the jungle, and I felt disintegrated.
Absolutely. So that experience can release. To go back to trauma, in trauma, a lot of bitter emotion and a lot of charged energy gets suppressed. That's the nature of trauma. That is what trauma is. Again, I'll be talking about that over the next 2 days. And when you manifest the mind through this substance, a lot of stuff comes up. But if you look at the context in which these practices evolved, they were in communities with the shaman who knew the participants. Yeah. And the participants shared a common culture. There wasn't a bunch of strangers come together for one night and then dispersing in the morning.
That's right.
So our thought was, as soon as I first experienced ayahuasca, my thought was, well, how can we then create at least a temporary community where people get to know and love each other and support each other, at least over a short period of time, like a week. And then how can we go into ceremony preparing, developing an intention and developing an understanding, and then afterwards processing what happened. So that's what I do now. I lead these retreats with the plant just a couple of times a year. It's all I have time for, but it's the most powerful thing that I do, and I could read you and tell you about the amazing transformations that people experience. You wouldn't believe it.
I would believe it. I'm a medical anthropologist. I would believe it. But I know that feeling of being safe and being understood afterwards, of being held in the cultural context, whether it's the temporary ones you've created with real care and compassion, or whether it is the village itself. I was a North American heading down there and was not within I was in one of these kind of fast and dirty ecotourism ones, so there's some it's a cultural appropriation and some misguided use as well, and that's really why I honor our center right now.
And there's a lot of that. A lot. But let me just read you something an email I got today from somebody who's married to a man who is is quite an alcoholic, and he's written a fairly well-known book in Canada about his alcoholic history, and he came to the retreat. And then the wife writes me today, I've been meaning to tell you this for a while, but the longer I delay, the more I believe I'm witnessing the beauty of ayahuasca. Since my husband has returned from Mexico, he's a different person. The restlessness, irritation, reactivity greatly diminished. People, events that would normally trigger a downward spiral of negativity are met with smiles and acceptance. He seems at peace with all that has gone before. The nightmares have also greatly diminished. He's experiencing the best sleep I've seen for 7 years. They've been together 7 years. When there's been a difficult moment, it is over quickly, and he doesn't allow it to destroy his day. He seems very committed to the meditation process began at the retreat, but this is after 7 days and 3 ceremonies. And I could give you more miracles than this. Now, it's not a panacea, and there are others who are still struggling to integrate what they experienced, and we wanted to give them that support. So it's not like, drink this and you'll be saved. It's not like that at all. It is work, but nothing I've seen has such immediate potential. When it's properly done, it can also do harm if it's not properly done.
I love the way your colleague, you wrote a foreword for him, Dr. Joe Taffer, right? It's a book, The Fellowship of the River. It just came out, I think, this year
Yeah,
as
just
well.
a month ago or so.
Beautiful. He talks about it as if it's opening corridors of communication to deep-seated emotions.
That's right.
You know, and that deep-seated emotions that he feels were sometimes forgotten or suppressed or just ignored, whoever, that if you can have that experience and in a loving context, a caring context, it is powerful medicine.
By the way, I should also just for the sake of truth in advertising, so I've done these ceremonies for years now, and mostly I've done them in the context of guiding others. I don't lead the ceremonies, I'm not a shaman, but I do lead the processing. But my wife Ray, who's in the room with me, is never all that impressed with how I come back from these experiences, and
what did she say?
Sorry?
What did she tell you?
Well, so what happens is I go to these retreats and I'm just really on. I mean, I'm just really present, and I'm just working, 14 hours a day, and being there for everybody, and drinking and not sleeping, And I come back. On the one hand, I come back full of what a wonderful guy I am, having done all this great work. On the other hand, I'm totally bagged, because it's hard work. So you get a combination of this swollen head over this depleted body, and that's what Ray's got to live with, So, on the other hand, I participated in a yoga course for the first. I thought I'm never going to do yoga. I'm not a yoga person. I got ADHD. I can't just,
But you did it.
So I met this yogi.
Good.
Whose name is Sadhguru. Some of you have heard about him in September, and I won't go into the whole story of how I met him, but I met him personally, and I was really impressed that he's a man who's actually got presence, and it said he's connected to the deep, or to the high, or to the full, or to the limitless. You can just tell that he has. So he devised a 4-day yoga course, which I participated in October, and that's made an enormous difference, more than, for me, drinking the plant has ever done, personally. So it's one thing, so I can facilitate other people's transformation.
Yeah.
But I suppose I've never surrendered to my own in terms of the plant work. So for that I'd have to go.
What an insight! My
Sorry?
God. Yeah, what amazing insight there, though.
Yeah.
It was done through the breath work, the asanas, the yoga
Yeah,
itself.
That's right.
Just going into those asanas, those postures, did this?
And the teaching that he gives along with it, and something about it called to me. So I've done it very, very in a disciplined way that I never thought I would muster. So what I'm saying is that, just to go back to what I said earlier, plants are exciting and kind of sexy these days, but it's not the only way.
No,
It's not the only way.
many paths.
Many
paths.
That's right.
Well, we've been chatting for an hour. We have another hour here together, and I would love to be able to open it up to the many questions that are all rolling through your minds as well. And I think we've covered the milestones of books, the milestones of insights that led to each one. If there's other things, just throw out comments if you want me to go back to some aspects, or, yes.
Now, are
I
we
think
getting a
we
mic?
do need a microphone.
Are we getting in the mics now?
I can, until that mic comes, I can repeat your question for here, sure.
So if San Francisco is going to try a supervised injection site,
Oh, there it
Here
is.
you go.
if San Francisco is going to try a supervised injection site, I'm wondering if the universal health care in Canada was a kind of a prerequisite or a necessary foundation that made that much easier to pull off than here in the States with our current healthcare system, if that won't be a much bigger hill to climb down here.
Yeah, there was never a question of who's going to pay for it. You know, it was the governments on the municipal, federal, and provincial level, like a state level, they all came together. The constellation of governments at that time was favorable, so that the funding was never a problem, and people don't have to pay to come in and use the facility. So it's just not an issue up there. How it would work here with your nightmare of an insurance system, I have no idea.
Except for San Francisco does have its own city insurance, and California has a bill in the works as well. I mean, we're just gonna do everything that the federal government won't do. I think we're just gonna have our own state here of California that puts forth these kinds of things. Seattle is another city I'm watching very closely that's also probably heading towards a safe injection site as well. They've done even more research on it in the last 2 years than we have. So, and Seattle has sort of a complex network of a safety net as well throughout King County and other places that may just
And they have a very
satisfy.
reasonable police department there, on the whole.
I live there too, I found. Thank you for that. I will keep track of it. There's a hand up way back there. Go ahead and shout out.
No, just go ahead, yeah.
We're gonna take it. Thank you.
Dr. Maté, just a personal question. I got diagnosed with borderline personality disorder,
Okay.
with all the bonuses come with it: anxiety, ADHD,
ADHD, you said?
yes.
Okay.
And do you recommend, or I don't know, the only social support is therapy. So do you recommend me taking some blends or something?
Do I recommend what, sorry?
Taking the blend?
Oh, you mean like a plant medicine?
Or, yeah.
Well, first of all, what are your symptoms that are bothering you right now?
I can never stay in relationship more than like, it's like a roller coaster, and I can never stay in a job like more than a year, and I always like adjust myself into a social event like work or different. I just treat different people different ways, so it's like multiple personality, and I was super depressed, and right now in the last couple of days I had like mental breakdown. So,
Okay.
so what's your suggestion for what's your advice or for any?
Okay, so here's the thing. I don't know you, so I'm just going to make a very general statement, and you're going to have to decide whether it is accurate or not for you. And thank you for being so forthright with telling your own personal. I was speaking about your despair, so coming. There's nothing wrong with you. Your symptoms are normal responses to abnormal situation. The abnormal situation, and here's where I'm taking a leap of, I don't call it faith, but leap of some kind. You were traumatized as a child. You have every reason not to trust relationships, because the first relationships you were in hurt you. And the Buddha said that with the minds we create the world. But what he didn't say was that before with our minds we create the world creates our minds. So when you're hurt in your early relationships, and I'm not blaming parents, but whatever they were going through, they were not able to be nurturing, supportive, accepting, consistently emotionally available for you. What else could you conclude with your child's mind but that you can't trust relationships? So as soon as intimacy happens, it terrifies you because it reminds you of the kind of suffering that you experienced that you barely even can recall. Maybe you can't recall at all, but that you would have experienced in your very early years. In other words, what I'm talking about is trauma. So and my guess is, and I don't know this for sure, but again, my guess is that if you're the average patient, then it doesn't matter how many psychiatrists you go to, they'll never ask you about trauma. The average medical student does not hear the word trauma in 4 years of training. The average psychiatrist hears it only in the context of PTSD as a specific diagnosis. So your diagnoses don't explain anything. They describe things. They describe how you function and how your emotional dynamics. They describe them, they don't explain them. The explanation is the trauma that you experienced and the impacts of which you're still carrying. And so unless you find a way to get help with addressing the trauma issues in your life, nothing's going to change. Now, the plant medicine is one way of addressing trauma when it's done in the right context. Again, I have to say that, because all kinds of stuff will come up for you that you'll need support to deal with. But whether you do it with plant medicine or whether you do it without plant medicine, the trauma has to be addressed. There's some good trauma therapists here in California, I'm sure Meg knows some, other people here know others. But one way or the other, it's those core causative issues that have to be addressed, not just your symptoms. So again, the diagnoses don't explain, they just describe. The explanation is in your early experience. Am I making sense to you?
Yes. I'm doing the therapy right now, and we always, every day, every time we always talking about what happened in the past, but every time I talk to my therapist, I feel so despair to the next time, and I feel so vulnerable.
Yeah.
Until the next time I see him, and I don't think it's really it's work for me. I don't.
Okay, look, I don't know who you're seeing or what kind of work they do. It's not enough that you talk about the past. The essence of trauma is that people don't know how to be in the present. And so talking about the past will bring up all kinds of despair and fear and suffering for you. The therapist you're seeing has to be able to work with that in the moment that it arises. So you can talk about the past for 20 years, you'll never get anywhere. I can't say more to you than that. But whoever you're seeing has to be able to make you feel safe in the present moment so that you can actually experience those emotions and know that they will pass. And yes, just talking about the past is going to leave you just upset. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's very encouraging stating all that. And there's more somatic-based kinds of work as well. I want to encourage that they can help. They can help with the soothing of the nervous system that's fried as well. It could really work. And
Hi, Dr. Maté. I think
Sir, where are you?
we're going over here. Sorry,
Okay, yeah,
Janara.
hi.
We're meeting on Monday, but I wanted to get another side of this conversation going. And actually, it's a very good segue. I was wondering if you could speak to how you kind of track. So there's, the trauma that happens to someone when they're a child, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's sort of the collective trauma that builds out from so many of us experiencing trauma. So I feel that part of the situation that you're describing, and that I wonder if you could speak to, is how just being alive in the world today is very traumatizing. And so it's sort of, if you're feeling ill, it's sort of mirroring ill symptoms of the society. So I just want to know if you could speak to that kind of, that dynamic between what happens in childhood and...
So what is it about living in the world today that's traumatizing?
I think the speed, I think, is quite traumatizing for a lot of people.
Okay.
Even basic things like the rush of the car going down the street.
Right.
I think the emphasis on human beings as consumers only,
Yeah.
and that kind of perpetual drive.
Yeah.
It's not natural, right? And it kind of it separates us from our natural state, I guess. Another trauma I would say is the way in which we've been kind of divorced from our bodies as a whole, and
Okay.
we know that we don't really sense into our feelings, and some of that has to do with the way we're divorced from like, you know, just the earth and nature and our environment. So I think in all those ways we are traumatized by everyday life.
Right. So, thank you. So that makes it really clear. Well, I mean, this book I'm gestating very slowly. Toxic culture. So, if you had a culture medium, and in the laboratory, if you're growing microorganisms, you put them in a broth, and that broth is called a culture medium. They grow in that culture medium. Now, 70% of the organisms in that culture start dying or dying early or developing all kinds of dysfunctions or diseases. You say this is a toxic culture. We live in a toxic culture for all the reasons and many more that you've listed. That's the nature of our society. This society is against human beings. It's a materialistic society, which means that what matters is matter. And so the production, possession, and consumption of matter is what matters. Well, how can you not have a toxic culture based on those principles? And the people that most benefit from that are the ones who actually govern. I mean, you think you live in a democracy? You really think you live in a democracy? So that is true. There's no individual answer to that question. That's a matter of history. That's a matter of social movements. That's a matter of economic changes. That's a matter of crises that cause people to have to wake up in a massive way. I can't give you a here's how to answer to that one, except to say that on strict physiological grounds, those that are acting powerfully and are engaged with others, even if they don't succeed, are still better off than those who are isolated and in despair and resigned. But it's in the nature of the system to keep people isolated, in despair and resigned. And therefore, then they put their faith into leaders. And so you have this desperate faith of these poor Trump supporters that he's going to screw over and over and over and over the course of his presidency, who actually think he's going to save them. So, no, I don't have an answer except to say that those that see the light, or they think they see the light, if they want to stay healthy and make a difference over the long term, they need to shine that light as brightly as they can, through whatever means that's available to them.
I think I want to add to that, the shining of the light, too. I think, Gabor, I agree with that on so much of the toxic culture, and I also know that we live in an age of complexity. So at one end of that spectrum is this growth of toxicity, and at the other end are people working very hard to help others shore up coping mechanisms, build resiliency, look at their positive psychology attributes, my God, there's like 15 books now on how to practice the happiness habit. Are these panaceas? I mean, in the face of a toxic culture, or is this really the other end of the spectrum in an age of complexity of people working hard to say, let's grow a new nervous system?
Well, what is totally true is that I was thinking about that today, just as you say, that there's just as a result of the increasing crisis of the what I will call the American imperialist system, and I'm not talking, when I say imperialist, I'm not making that word for condemnation, I'm just describing something. It's an imperium, it's an empire, like all empires that bestride the world and suck up its resources and dominate it militarily. You're living at the heart of an empire, which to much of the rest of the world lives like you're living in Mordor. And in terms of how they experience it. So when, I heard Noam Chomsky give an interview the other day, and he was saying that when you look at international polls as to what country people see as the greatest danger to world peace, Iran is something like number 20 on the list, and America is first. I'm just telling you, that's how it's seen. Not that you'll ever know that from your media. So an imperial structure is like an octopus that sucks up the energies and resources of the world. And it cannot sustain itself. No empire ever can. And what's happened to empires historically is, if you look at the Roman Empire, it lasted many hundreds of years. Subsequent empires last less and less. So the British Empire, at its height, lasted a few hundred years, a couple hundred years. The American Empire reached its apogee immediately after the Second World War, and has been in trouble ever since, and is in increasingly trouble, and so that the contradictions are becoming much more blatant. Hence, you can see these inequality statistics. I was just reading a report in Lancet, which is a British medical magazine. The top 1% in the U.S. has a 10 to 15 year greater life expectancy than the bottom 1%.
You see it from zip code to zip code, too.
But yeah, the zip code, and it's getting worse. So, so the contradictions are getting clearer, which also means that people looking for solutions are getting more and more acute and more insightful, which is what you were talking about. And so that our understanding of trauma now is infinitely better than it was 30, 40 years ago. And so this is just a bit of Marx. Karl Marx said that every system will create its own contradictions, and the antidote will develop within the system itself. So just as it's getting worse, there's also elements moving towards the better.
Yeah.
But we're talking about historical processes here. It ain't going to happen overnight. On the personal level, of course, there's much more available to people now than ever before.
Your yoga class.
My yoga class, and like Yogananda came to the U.S. in the 1920s and establishes the first yoga teachings and fellowships, and now it's just like, so just as the system gets more and more desperate and more toxic and more violent, at the same time, the antidotes are also rising within it. That's just how human nature works.
We need those antidotes. And we are a school of antidotes. And so we give out certificates and degrees in antidotal.
That's a good way to put it.
Very good. There's a hand right here up and one over here. Oh, thank you. You are on top of it. Thank you.
So I work in entertainment, and I was really interested in what you said about parents and how they need to hang on to their kids and the attachment of kids in society today to each other. I work on an app that gives teenagers a way to kind of explore who they are and think about their identity, and there are some pretty heavy themes that come up from clearly traumatized kids. And you know, I've always been kind of inspired by Mr. Rogers, who thought
Oh, yeah.
that television, you know, wasn't going to go away, so he wanted to make something that worked and helped children from within.
I love you just the way you are.
A beautiful man, really.
Melts me.
And he's always been an inspiration for me in my work, that sometimes working in technology and seeing kids, you know, attaching to each other, but also just attaching to their devices and things like that, more than to humans, is really difficult. And knowing how to kind of guide children, teenagers in the world we live in is my question, is kind of like, how do we work within this toxic culture that we can't change overnight? So how do we work within it to help kids? If you have any ideas about that, about what people can do.
Well, if you look at what kept kids healthy and gave them self-confidence and resilience and a capacity to face the world the way it was, and a sense of belonging, and a sense of connection, what gave it to kids historically? Relationships with nurturing adults. That's what has to be restored. And I don't believe that's done through technology. Technology could be a part of it, but only a very small part. Because technology itself, the way it's set up today, becomes, as you said, a source of attachment. So whoever works with kids needs to work with them with as much physical and emotional connection, safety, nurturing, acceptance as you can generate and as the context allows for. So I don't see a way of working with kids without actually working with kids.
I want to help you too. I have 3 grad students right now who are working with tech and apps and looking at values embedded in there that were actually for teens and adults, actually teens and children rather, that could look at value embedded cultures created within the app that could really help. I think there's a possibility there. You know, I think that the social pressure and social coercion that we see on places like Facebook, you know, is a dark side, a shadow side of technology. But there's also and kids are so prone to those forces of conformity as well, and not wanting to.
Well, you know, I'm going to dissent here. I just don't see a whole lot of hope in working through apps. I just don't. And for the reason, like if you actually look at Facebook.
You're in the middle of app land here.
I know you are. I know you're in the middle of
Silicon Alley.
But if you look at Facebook itself, it's a product of peer orientation. It's a product of kids cut off from nurturing adult contacts. What do people have on Facebook? They have friends. What is that? It's an attachment dynamic. People like each other. But nobody knows each other, because to know somebody, it's not enough to know their image and what muffin they're eating at 10 o'clock in the morning. You have to hear their voice. You have to see how they respond to you personally. The social engagement system that involves our cranial nerves and the certain parts of autonomic nervous system that makes me turn my head towards you and makes you listen not just to the content of my words, but also the prosody, the rhythm, and the tone in which I'm speaking. And I mean, you and I are talking to each other, you're nodding at me right now, and you're smiling at me.
It's my mirror neurons.
Well, that ain't gonna happen on in an app. You know,
No.
and that's what people need.
I've got a healthy, smart Vegas at work right now, but I
Yeah.
think that that's because I grew up in this exceptionally close Italian-Irish family, and you know, they wouldn't, you could not even be on the phone in the kitchen if it was dinner time. You had to
Right.
sit and look everybody in the face. And
Right.
so that kind of face-to-face interaction, I totally honor it. I see where it, and how it blossoms, but I've also got grad students who are 25 years old who's saying, "You're a Luddite, Dr. Jordan. You look at this. This is my app, and I connect on this. This is my community."
I know, and I say that's exactly right. That's what the problem is. Why would I don't know. I have a 28-year-old daughter who's in the room, so this is a debate that we have all the time. But you know what? I'm not prepared to take my direction from a 25-year-old brought up in a technological, peer-oriented culture, you know, who's never experienced anything else. How can they help it but have a certain point of view?
Yeah.
How can they help it but have a certain point of view, which point of view reflects the essence of the culture that I don't say nourished them, but that influenced them. Not much nourishment there, but there's a whole lot of influence. And so, no, I wouldn't argue with them either.
High influence, but low contact, low warmth.
Absolutely. So I wouldn't argue with them either, because arguing is not going to get anywhere. But I would want to build a relationship with them in which there's some lines of communication that are built up.
Well, some of them remind me of the little rhesus monkey that hugged the button monkey. Remember the button monkey?
Yeah.
Hey, this is the button monkey right here.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
it's just a feeling, wanting to feel safe, wanting to feel understood. I mean,
Yeah.
that phrase permeates so much of your writing, so much of your speaking, feeling safe, feeling understood. I do want to reinforce that,
We have another,
I know.
we have another microphone over there.
Okay, well,
I read a few weeks ago, Dr. Maté, your article about Donald Trump and the brutality of his father, and you also
Yeah.
mentioned Hillary Clinton having experienced something like that. It was a very compassionate article in a way, and I appreciated it. And also, that you said, you know, it takes people who perhaps have also been brutalized to then support someone like that, so that it's a mirror, perhaps a mirror relationship. And so, I guess my question is, how in the world do we, you know, not respond to someone like Donald Trump when we've been brutalized ourselves? Are there some kind of attraction there, you said, that allows us to think that that's the person we should have as our leader?
well, okay, so thank you. What I said in that article written for a Canadian newspaper a few months ago was that if you look at Trump, he exhibits every sign of trauma. The low self-esteem, therefore the low self-esteem, which is then coupled with the hyperinflated ego, but it is inflated, it's like a balloon, you prick it, then more people came to my party than went to Barack's party, you know? How old is that person? A 3-year-old, who's not enough people came to his birthday party. He had a brutal father who demeaned him. His brother died of alcoholism. His ADHD is off the charts. He cannot read a book. He cannot stay on topic for a minute. A highly traumatized person. Hillary is perhaps a more subtle example. And I don't know how many saw the Democratic Convention. When after she was nominated, they played a video of her life, narrated in sonorously laudatory terms by Morgan Freeman. And Freeman,
The voice of God.
yeah, literally the voice of God.
Like that.
And Freeman tells this anecdote, whose only source could have been Hillary. And says, and this was, you must understand, this anecdote is told as an example of beautiful character building. Now, remember how during the campaign she gets pneumonia, she doesn't tell anybody, she collapses, she has to be picked up and carried into the van. Okay, now, what a dedicated person. The anecdote is that Freeman tells is that 4-year-old Hillary runs into the house because she's being threatened or bullied by some neighborhood kids. And her mother says, "There are no room for cowards in this house. Now get out and deal with those kids." And this is given as an example of beautiful character building. Now, what is the actual message? The message is not that there's no room for cowards in this house. There's nothing cowardly about a 4-year-old seeking support from mommy. When she's in danger, any animal will do that. The message is there's no room for your emotions in this house. There's no room for your vulnerability in this house. So then she develops this invulnerable, impervious persona. And I really do believe that she started her career with some ideals. But all that was underneath this, nothing can touch me. So it doesn't matter how many women my husband humiliates. I'm going to be on his side, and those women, those vulnerable ones, I'm going to despise. Because my vulnerability was despised. And those were your two candidates. Those were your two candidates. And now how can we, and what I also said was, and the thing about, now, did Hillary suffer from misogyny? Sure she did, because she was totally inauthentic. But inauthenticity in a woman is not forgiven.
Yeah.
Whereas in the male politicians, it's taken for granted.
Yeah.
You know, so that, yeah, there's misogyny there, all right. But anybody connected to their gut feelings, deeply connected to gut, will look at either of those people and say, no, thank you.
Yeah.
Because they just don't resonate on a human level. And so, what I said in the article was that it's in this traumatized society, we're so disconnected from ourselves. See, I don't have to listen to their policies. I don't have to listen to the content of their words. It's like George Bush. If you look at George Bush, I'm talking about the junior one now, and if you turned off the sound on the television when he announced the invasion of Iraq, which I did. I was in a book tour in Toronto, actually, when the body says no, and I think, and I was in a hotel room, and he's announcing the attack on Iraq. If you turn off the sound, what did you see when you looked at George Bush?
Fear.
What did you see?
Fear.
Fear. A little kid, a 3 or 4-year-old in absolute fright. His furrowed brows, his inarticulateness, you know, these are traumatized people, one after the other. And in a society totally divorced, as you said, from ourselves and our gut feelings, we get fooled. We don't act on our gut feelings anymore. And then we're led around by the nose, literally. And that's the reality.
There was another almost candidate, Bernie.
Yeah. He's the closest to being authentic that I've
Bernie.
seen, you know.
Yeah.
And needless to say, he had no chance whatsoever. Because the Democratic establishment made sure.
I know.
I mean, my
He
question,
was
I
sabotaged.
actually, I met his press secretary in New York a couple of weeks ago, because I gave a fundraiser for a harm reduction organization in New York, and she introduced me. And her name is Sanders as well, and the press always said, no relation. Well, this is this, you know, powerful black woman, and anybody could tell it's no relation. But I asked her, and I'm wondering for your consideration, if the Democratic establishment could have known, and they should have known, that by electing Hillary as their candidate, they're going to lose. Because I mean, so many people didn't like her for all kinds of reasons. Some of them good, some of them not so good. But that was just the reality. And if they'd known that with Sanders they could have beaten Trump, which they probably could have, would they still have elected Hillary? I think they still would have.
Yeah.
Because I think they were terrified of Sanders, terrified of anybody who's that authentic. Not that I think Sanders could have made a whole lot of difference. The empire doesn't change because you put a nicer guy in charge of it. But at least we'd be beating a lot easier, and all these terrible things wouldn't be happening right now.
We would be dismantling our EPA.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know the Supreme Court judge they just approved.
Yes.
Mhm.
Do you know the story about him?
Yes.
One vote, one famous case.
Hobby Lobby.
There was a truck driver.
Truck driver.
The truck driver. There's this truck driver who's driving his truck, and his sub-zero, and his brakes failed because of the freezing. So he pulls over to the side of the road. He waits 3 hours for help to arrive. It doesn't, and he starts getting numb in the feet and so on. So he decides to uncouple the cab from the truck and drive to safety. He gets fired for abandoning a company property. It goes to court. The majority rules that actually the company had no right to fire him because he's just protecting his safety. Your new Supreme Court judge said that he should have been fired.
Yeah.
This is the guy who's now in your Supreme Court.
Oh, yeah, and he's
Unbelievable.
I mean, he talks about women as being in the wrong for wanting contraception covered. I mean, that they were wrongdoers somehow. Yeah.
So at least under Sanders, this wouldn't happen, nor under Hillary, to tell the truth.
So I am the county director of an intensive outpatient program that serves the homeless population in San Rafael, California.
Yeah.
And one thing that I find myself running up against, because I have a lot on my plate, is self-care.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we as healers, and also as people that are also recovering from co-occurring disorders as well, how we take care of ourselves.
Are you in my workshop tomorrow?
Yes.
Okay, well, you know what, can I leave it for tomorrow then?
Yes, you
Because the whole day will be about that.
Yeah, wonderful. Preventing burnout as well. I hope you cover that.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for being here. My question might be kind of selfish, but I'm in recovery
Well,
from
that's
drugs.
terrible, we must know how that was.
Disclaimer. I'm in recovery from drugs and alcohol,
Yeah.
and so when I read your work, I don't read it because I'm like curious or an intellectual. I read it because it's my lived experience, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you think is the solution, because you talked a little bit about spirituality and ayahuasca, and for me and for a lot of people that I know, and I would say most of the people in my life are also sober addicts and alcoholics, or people that are dying from addiction. I didn't have to drink ayahuasca, but I did have to surrender, reach out. And when I say reach out, I don't mean to a doctor, and I don't mean to my friends and family, because I was in therapy for most of my life, and I've suffered every type of trauma that you've briefly mentioned. And I've read books, and I did yoga, and I meditated, and none of that helped me even one slight little bit. When I say reaching out, I mean reaching out to someone else who has the same problem as me, who solved it. And my life's been transformed, and I've found a power greater than myself. And I know that when you talk about loneliness and isolation, like addressing that has been something that's worked for my community. And
So are you in a 12-step program?
yeah, I'm in a 12-step program, and I know that some of your beliefs don't quite add up with some of their beliefs, but I'm just curious, like, what your opinion is, or if you've worked with people who are in recovery or seen people through to their recovery.
Where do you think I disagree with 12 steps?
No, I don't think you do. I think 12-step programs, well, I just read your article that came out that said alcoholism and addiction isn't a disease.
Well, I know it
And
isn't.
that's something in 12-step
I
programs
know.
that they do talk
So-
about. So I'm wondering if it's just a difference in terminology, and you're both saying the same thing.
No, so
or-
here's the thing. So first of all, I have nothing but respect for the 12 steps. The higher power, the acknowledging the powerlessness of the ego over the process, the moral inventory, all that. They're 12 steps, not just for people who are addicted, they're 12 steps of any human being. I mean, if those 12 steps were practiced by all human beings, we'd have a much better world. So that's my take on the 12 steps. My problem with the 12-step organizations, however, is they ignore the source of the problem. They never talk about trauma. Bill W. himself, the founder of AA, was a traumatized child. His parents abandoned him when he was 11 or 12 years old. But they never talk about trauma. So they talk about it as a disease, and mostly as an inherited one, which is just not accurate. And, there's another email which I got this evening from somebody who's been in those programs, and he says, she wasn't saved by them. So, and I think many more people could be helped by the 12 steps if the 12-step organizations also incorporated some awareness of trauma into their consciousness. So that's my criticism of them. And I don't know if in your experience the 12 steps helped you address the traumas or whether they didn't, but mostly they don't. No, that's the first part of what I have to say. Secondly, there's no one size fits all. So, I mean, there's not, nothing is a panacea. Ayahuasca is not a panacea. 12 steps are not a panacea. Panacea meaning that it works for everybody. Nothing works for everybody. So there's no ones. Some people need to be engaged on the harm reduction level. The 12-step programs tend to be very critical of harm reduction. They say, why are we giving heroin to heroin addicts? Why are you giving methadone to heroin addicts? Some 12-step programs, if you're on methadone, you can't be in the program, which to me is crazy. No, that's not universal. I know it's different from place to place. So what I'm saying is that you say, what's the answer? There's no the answer. There's many, many answers depending on the individual, the place, and the resources available. I just think we have to have a very multifaceted approach. The one thing I will say is encompassed in the word recovery. So what does it mean to recover something? I'm asking you, what does it mean to recover something?
For me?
Yeah, what does it mean to recover something? Just the word itself.
Oh, just the word itself?
When you recover something, what have you done?
You've found something
found
that
it.
you've lost.
Exactly. And what did you find?
And in general,
What did you find through your recovery?
what have I found?
Yeah.
Peace, serenity,
Okay,
acceptance,
okay.
happiness, freedom. I would say freedom most of all.
And those feel good to you, right?
Yeah, they feel pretty fucking good.
Yeah. and the reason they feel good to you is because that's who you are. That's your fundamental self. So what you really recovered is yourself. Okay, and which means to say that the essence of trauma is disconnection from the self, and recovery is reconnection with the self. How you get there depends on the individual. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a question about with so many of these conditions not being inherited, being sourced from trauma. Does autism fall into that same category in your
Well, autism is an interesting question because you've seen the diagnosis burgeoning. I mean, we've got 30 times as much autism as you did 40 years ago, or 40 times as you did 30 years ago, I forget which. Now, that could be in a combination of factors. It could be that we've always had that much autism, we just didn't know how to recognize it, but I think that's not the case. So whatever's driving it, it can't be genetic. Because genes just don't explode like that over a few decades. So there's got to be something going on. Now, I think what's going on is that there are probably genetic sensitivities. The sensitivity is not the same as a predetermination. It just means that when stuff happens, the sensitive person is more affected by it. But stuff still has to happen. And I think what's happening is social stress, particularly in women and particularly in pregnant women. And I think that's affecting their neurological development. And we know this is not fanciful. I mean, we know, for example, women who are ill during pregnancy, their risk of kids being autistic goes up. The reality is, and this is again not controversial, is that already in utero, the emotional states of the mother have an impact on the developing brain and nervous system of the child. And you can this is known in human studies, animal studies. I could cite dozens of them for you. So I think what's happening is that women are increasingly stressed. Now, let me just take a side route here. Why do I say women are increasingly stressed? If you look at a condition like multiple sclerosis, in the 1940s, the gender ratio was much closer than what it is now. Maybe a few more women than men. You know what the ratio now is? 3.5 women to every man. Now, it can't be genetic. The genes don't change in 70 years. It can't be the food, it can't be the climate, because those haven't changed more for one gender than the other. What has changed? Increased stress, because women have always had the roles, the culturally appointed roles of being the emotional caregivers of their spouses and their families, the stress absorbers, the stress sponges. But now they also have an economic role to play. and they have that economic role to play without the other role having been in any way alleviated by more input from men. So now they have double duty. And this is in the context of less communal support, less connection, less clan, less tribe, less community, less extended family. More stress, less support. Multiple sclerosis is a highly stress-driven disease. That's just one example. I'm saying the same factors are affecting the developing infant in the mother's wombs.
And do you say
That's my theory. I can't prove it, but that's my theory.
And do you say that because it's happening before birth, because you're seeing the signs of autism so early? Is that part of the reason why you're saying that?
I'm saying that because you see the signs so early. Now, then of course what happens is that it's not just that the parents create the child also creates the parents. It's called the recursive nature of development. So if a kid is colicky, now the kid is colicky, literally the kid is having gut feelings, it's that simple. And kid is colicky because of the stress in the parenting environment that the parents might not even know about, because they're unconscious to it, because they have been all their lives. But the sensitive infant is picking on it, so she's colicky. What happens to a parent when the kid is colicky? She gets anxious, more stressed. What does that do to the kid? So I think there's a kind of a dynamic here. This is my vague theory. I've not researched autism. I have some articles on it, not I've written, but I've collected. They tend in the same direction, but I'm just giving you, since you asked, okay? I'm not ready to write a book about it.
There could be some epigenetic wear and tear as well on the single nucleotide polymorphisms, also things that I study from a functional medicine viewpoint that looks like just a fancy way of saying stress is wearing us down, right down to our DNA as well.
I mean, we know that stress can affect genetic functioning.
Yeah.
Not the gene structure, but the functioning of genes.
Two over here. Do you have one there?
Would you be willing to talk about the next 2 days? If there's more, if you can speak a little bit more than just
Sure.
what
So,
the website says.
So does anybody, is the topic tomorrow when the body says no?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the book that Meg has in her hands, and so that's about how we generate stress for ourselves in ways that we're not aware of, and that's based on childhood programming, and that stress that we generate, in response to childhood experiences, we develop certain coping patterns. Those coping patterns that we're not aware of because they become our personality, and we think we're our personality. We're not our personality. Personality is largely a coping mechanism. Not purely, but largely. Certain coping patterns that then generate stress for us in ways that we don't not aware of, and those stresses then make us sick. And how to recognize that, how to work with that. Fundamentally, the thesis of when the body says no is that when people don't know how to say no, the body will say it for them in the form of symptoms or illness. And so self-care, prevention of burnout, connection with oneself, recognizing the signs of inauthentic being and how that manifests in illness and so on. That's the subject of tomorrow. Sunday will be about addiction. And when I say addiction, I'm not talking about drug addiction. Well, let's just do a test here. I'm anticipating Sunday, but I'll ask you a question. Addiction is any behavior that a person craves, finds temporary pleasure in, and relief in, but suffers negative consequences and can't give it up despite the negative consequences. That's what an addiction is. Notice I said nothing about substances. It could be to substances, could also be to sex, to gambling, to the internet, to technology, to gambling, to shopping, to eating, and so on. So that, according to that definition, now just raise your hand if you've ever had an addictive pattern in your life, okay? Right. That's how widespread addiction is, okay? And now I'm going to ask you another question. This is about the disease thing. I'm not going to ask you what you were addicted to, when, or for how long. I'm just going to ask you, what did it do for you? What did you like about it in the short term? Okay? So would somebody tell me? Just raise your hand and tell me, okay? Yeah, what did it do for you? It
Good.
comfort.
Relieve,
Okay,
pleasure.
it relieves pain. Is that right? So comfort, pleasure.
Pleasure.
Felt good.
What's that?
Felt
Eh,
good.
okay, it felt good.
Soothed.
It's soothed. Okay, very good. Let's just take those. So, if you needed comfort, it's because you were in discomfort. If you needed pain relief, it's because you were in pain. If you needed soothing, it's because you were in turmoil. If you need to feel good, it's because you didn't feel good. So the addiction is not actually a disease or a problem. The addiction was your attempt to solve the problem. The problem of not feeling good, the problem of not being comfortable in your own skin, the problem of not being able to contact pleasure in God's green earth, the problem of being in too much pain. And to understand that, you have to look at your life. In other words, I'm talking about trauma. So Sunday will be an examination of what addiction is, how it arises, and how to deal with it. That'll be Sunday.
We're gonna take the last question.
But so that's why to say that addiction is this brain disease, yeah, addiction manifests in the brain, and you can see the nerve circuits, the centers that are not working. But do you know something? That goes back to what I said earlier. The brain is shaped by the environment.
Yes.
So looking at the brain that is not functional doesn't tell me that it's a brain disease. It just tells me that the brain is showing the manifestations of trauma, which then drive human behavior in certain ways.
That's
So,
why I like you so much. You know, you're an honorary medical anthropologist. You really are. You've always, you know, you go deep into the personal psyche and trauma and everything else, but then you always rise out the other end and going, look at the culture, stupid. I mean, it's always where you wind up too. So thank you for that. I know we have one last question.
Thank you. I teach family medicine at UCSF. We are doing better at teaching ACEs than we did.
agree.
And my question is more to the societal edge of things, which is our addiction to oil.
Yeah.
You did a wonderful job in The Run with the Hungry Ghost in the last third, talking about how the war on drugs is an absolute failure and is destined to be a failure. And if you look at, Syria yesterday, we're doing the same thing in terms of war. And I guess looking at the 12-step method, how does America look at its pain? How does America address 12 steps? And what would your prescription be for our country?
Okay. Well, first of all, I don't agree that the war on drugs is a failure. I think it's a raging success. That's like saying, was the war in Iraq a failure? Was the Vietnam War a failure? No, it wasn't. Not for the weapons companies. Not for the defense establishment that gets to fatten off foreign adventures. Not for all the contractors and the politicians who gain support by being tough on communism or tough on terror or tough on whatever you want to be tough on today. So in other words, it's a success. It's the same with a war on drugs. It's a failure, I agree with you, if you actually believe that its stated purposes are its real purposes. But you'd think if that was the case, somebody would have woken up by now. If in good faith you think something's going to work and you try it over time and it doesn't work, if you're in good faith, you're going to say, it didn't work, let's try something else. Edison, Thomas Edison said, somebody asked him, how did it feel to fail how to build a light bulb 1,999 times? And he said, I didn't fail. I just found that there's that many ways not to build a light bulb. But at some point the light goes on, and you get it, then you try something different. Now, if that was the case with the war on drugs, we would have woken up a long time ago. So maybe it's not a failure at all. Maybe it's succeeding very well for the police establishment, for the legal establishment, for politicians who are tough on crime and tough on addicts. And maybe it's working really, really well for the private prison industry, and on and on and on and on and on. And the treatment industry, hugely profitable. As to what you say about America, well, unfortunately, no empire ever says, I want to stop being an empire. Okay, it's too lucrative. It feeds that addiction to wealth and power that keeps people imprisoned. They're very unhappy people. If you look at the Roman emperors, they were not a happy bunch. Not at all. But they never gave it up. except Marcus Aurelius, who, you know, he was the one Roman emperor, I think, to actually, and there was one, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He's like, there's a couple of guys in history who actually retired at the height of power, but not too many. It's too addictive. So I don't think that I can give you prescriptions. I think that's a process of history, and I'll finish with a statement of Noam Chomsky, who's the leading light. He was asked if he's a pessimist or an optimist, and he said, strategically, he said, I'm an optimist, but tactically I'm a pessimist. So I think in the short term it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And will it get better? Yes, it will. Will I live to see it? I don't think so. But in the meanwhile, you can't live on what will happen in the future or will not happen in the future. You have to live on what is your relationship to reality in the present moment. And from that point of view, it's always possible to seek the light. It's always possible to connect with yourself. It's always possible to act from your essence, to connect with people and all that. So it's not, you don't need to be gloomy about it, but as a historical process, it's going to be a long time.
Thank you. Thank you for connecting with your light and sharing it with everybody.
Thank you very much.